TanStack Start is seeing some hype these days, and the question is, should you switch from Next.js? Is it better than Next.js? Now, yesterday I had an entire live stream where I compared the two and built two apps, or one app twice, once with Next.js and one time with TanStack Start, and you can view that if you want to see that. But here I'll give you my short summary of what's different, what's better, and which one you should use. Of course, just my opinion, obviously not an objective comparison, but I'll share my experience about the two and what I think of Next.js and TanStack Start. Now, I came up with a couple of dimensions which I want to use for comparing the two, and you could add more, and you could also add more frameworks here. I mean, we could include Remix, React Router now, we could include Next for Vue, we could talk about SvelteKit, but I won't. This video is about Next.js and TanStack Start, not because the others are bad, but because these two are often compared. Now, first, it's worth noting that TanStack Start is in the end just TanStack Router plus some server stuff, mainly. So you can use TanStack Router standalone if you want to build a single-page application that doesn't need server-side rendering and server-side functions, for example. You can use TanStack Router instead of React Router in your React Vite app, for example. TanStack Start then, as mentioned, just adds server-side stuff to TanStack Router, making it a full React full-stack framework, just like Next.js, which of course is also a full-stack React framework. And that's also important. I sometimes get the question whether you should use Next.js or React Vite with React Router, and I think that's the wrong comparison. If you don't need server-side logic, if you don't need server-side rendering, then you should just use React Vite, so a Vite project with React, and add React Router or TanStack Router. There's no need to go down the Next.js route in that case. Anyways, let's start with that comparison. And the first dimension I picked is the AI readiness of the two, because of course that matters these days. You are very likely using AI for generating some code, maybe all of the code you want in your Next.js or TanStack Start project, and therefore AI of course needs to know how to write that code. Obviously, you can and you should provide appropriate context by copying documentation pages or by using an MCP like context7 to have the AI reach out to docs, or by telling the AI that it should do some web search, or by adding agent skills that teach the AI how to use TanStack Start or Next.js. But out of the box, if you just ask ChatGPT a TanStack Start question, it will very likely know less about it than it knows about Next.js, and what it knows is probably wrong. Because even now, when I'm recording this, TanStack Start is still in release candidate phase, which means no drastic breaking changes anymore, but also not fully stable. For the last year, it has primarily been in beta and alpha, though, and that is the knowledge these AI chatbots have out of the box, which is why they will out of the box have wrong knowledge about TanStack Start. So the AI readiness out of the box is not that great. It's definitely better for Next.js. Now, with Next.js, there of course also have been changes over the years. There is the new use cache directive, which the AI out of the box also doesn't know that well, but the AI has a decent, good understanding about the app router, about React server components and all that stuff. So it's definitely better for Next.js than for TanStack Start. But again, as mentioned, you should make sure that you give the AI the appropriate extra context it needs, otherwise you're just using AI wrong. What about the ecosystem? And with that, I mean other resources you can find, like tutorials, YouTube videos, courses, maybe also extra packages for these frameworks. And here, of course, Next.js also looks way better than TanStack Start, simply because it's older, it's been around longer. You'll find more resources on it because it is bigger too. It's also worth noting, of course, that it is bigger, which means more usage, because Next.js is part of that default stack the AI has, where it basically gives you Next.js, React, Tailwind, and TypeScript for most web apps you're requesting. TanStack Start will probably never be its default choice. And therefore, unsurprisingly, if you're comparing the download charts of the two, yeah, TanStack Start has definitely less downloads, as you can see. If you remove Next, you can see a nice upward trend for TanStack Start though. Kind of related to that ecosystem point is, of course, the ease of learning, but not just that. With ease of learning, I mean, how simple is it to learn the thing? And I know, of course, now in the age of AI, you're not interested in learning it, but as a good developer, you should understand the thing you're working with. You may not be writing all the code by hand anymore, but you should understand the code the AI generates for you. So learning it still is important. And here I would say for Next.js, it's mixed. You can give it, I'm not sure if I would want to give it 1 or 2 pluses, because getting started with Next.js, with the app router, and by the way, this all here refers to the app router, is pretty straightforward. It makes sense. Yesterday in the stream, I built a little note-taking application where you could create and save and render nodes. And you do that with Next.js by just specifying a couple of page TSX files, which are your, you guessed it, pages. You can have dynamic segments, and learning that syntax and that approach to building your application is pretty straightforward in the end. I also think the documentation does a good job at guiding you through the core concepts step by step and getting you started with Next.js. But things get more complex once you build more complex applications and once you dive into the more advanced concepts like caching. And especially the caching part can be super confusing because Next.js made the decision that with the introduction of the app router, they wanted to do some super aggressive caching on different layers, and understanding that and understanding how to configure your components to work well with that built-in caching and to give your users the behavior you want them to be can be tricky, I'll say that. So getting started is great. Learning the more advanced features is difficult. I'll probably give this 2 pluses here. And I'll give TanStack Start the same, but for very different reasons. For TanStack Start, I'd say that getting started is maybe a bit harder than with Next.js, because their getting started docs are not as good as the Next.js docs. Important concepts are missing here, I would say, like data fetching or mutations. Though if you already have Next.js knowledge, there is a pretty good comparison document that compares the key features, including related to data fetching and mutations. But I think it can be a bit harder because the docs, even though I will say they have been vastly improved, still have a little bit of that brain dump feeling where it's not super clear which article you need. And well, for example, there is no data fetching article here, and stuff like that. In addition, since TanStack Start is built up on TanStack Router, for all the routing related stuff, you have to go into the TanStack Router documentation, which also is rather overwhelming when you look at it the first time. But once you got over that initial barrier, it gets way easier, and it all, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense, and it's not that difficult, and there are no hidden footguns like the caching-related problems you may have with Next.js. That's why I would say that getting started is harder with TanStack Start, but once you're running, it's easier to progress and dive into the more advanced features than with Next.js. As mentioned, that's just my personal take on it, of course, though. Now, what about the ease of use from a developer's perspective? How fun is it to work with it? That is totally subjective, of course, but Next.js definitely has some problems here. Not just the problems related to learning potentially, but also other problems. For example, with the caching, it can happen that your app behaves differently in development mode than in production mode. Which means you always have to test it in production mode, which you should do anyways, but it gets rather annoying if you have to do this all the time during development because that slows you down. So that is one big problem I had in the past. The dev server can also get quite slow, at least if you're using the Webpack version. The new default TurboPack version is much better there, but in my experience, it doesn't beat the Vite-based setup TanStack Start gives you. So I'll give that 3 pluses here because in my experience, working with it has been super smooth from the developer experience point of view. It's fast, it's predictable, there is no weird behavior for the most part. There are still some quirks here and there, and it is still in release candidate phase. We must not forget this, but overall, I prefer the developer experience of TanStack Start over that of Next.js. Obviously, that may be different for you, though. Now, what about the concrete features offered by Next.js and TanStack Start? For the routing, as I showed you in Next.js, you have a file-based approach. You set up files which act as your routes, and there you have various naming conventions you have to follow. The documentation does a good job at explaining them, but there also definitely are more complex features like parallel routes, which can be quirky to set up. TanStack Start also has a file-based approach using TanStack Router under the hood as mentioned, and you also have file name conventions to follow here, which are also similarly easy to learn. One advantage you get out of TanStack Start is that with its file-based routing, it gives you full type safety, which can be pretty nice. So both are file-based, and it comes down to your preferences, which naming pattern you prefer, but TanStack Start also has that 100% type safety that comes with its file-based router, which is nice to have. And which also answers next question. Next.js has very good TypeScript support, and TanStack Start has even better TypeScript support in my experience. Also, when it comes to stuff like server actions or server functions, or however you want to call them, and data fetching. So yeah, when you use TypeScript, which you should, I think, TanStack Start is really a joy to work with. Now, when it comes to data fetching and data mutations, they both, as I mentioned, allow you to run code on the server. They're both full-stack React applications, but they take different approaches. Next.js uses React Server components, and for a long time it was the only framework that supported React Server components. That means that your page components by default are only rendered on the server. They're never re-rendered on the client, which means you can put your data fetching code, like this one, which will access a database behind the scenes, into your components, and that will not spill over to the client. TanStack Start has a different approach. React Server component support is going to land there too soon. It's not out yet when I'm recording this, but the approach I'm showing you here and I have used in all my projects will also continue to exist. And in that approach, your route components by default are rendered on both the server side and the client side, pre-rendered on the server side, updated on the client side, and therefore you can't put your server-side code into the component functions. Instead, it uses a loader pattern, which you might know from Remix, for example, where you can attach a loader to your routes, which will also run on the client and server side, but you can then call functions that are decorated or wrapped with create server function, so to say, which is a function provided by TanStack Start, which marks a function as to be run on the server side only, but callable from the client side. That is what a server function is. And if you have such a function, you can safely call it in a loader or also from the component function body, and the code will stay on the server side. Behind the scenes, an HTTP request will be sent. So Next.js primarily relies on RSC, though you could of course also set up API endpoints there and use useEffect with the fetch API. TanStack Start uses loaders and server functions, though it's also worth noting that there too, you can also set up API routes and use the fetch API, TanStack query, or anything like that. But the main built-in approach is this loader plus server function approach. For mutations, Next.js uses server actions, so that are actions that are decorated with this special use server directive. One of the things Next.js has are these directives, use server, use client. Some people don't like them. I'm also not a big fan, I will say. And if you have a file decorated with use server, then all the functions in there become server functions that will only be executed on the server, not on the client side. You can still call them from the client side though. So for example, this save node function, which I have here, which stores a node in the database, can still be called from the client side here by using the use action state hook, for example. In TanStack Start, we simply keep on using this create server function approach here, because I mentioned that are functions that are guaranteed to run on the server, and you can use them for data fetching or for data mutations, because again, the code will only run on the server. In a component function that is also rendered on the client. You can use the useServer function hook provided by TanStack Start to wrap your server function, and that essentially makes it callable from the client side and gives you extra features like automatic redirect handling and so on. So that then allows me to call that server function from my client-side components. So Next.js uses the official React server functions. TanStack Start uses their own server functions in the end. The general idea, of course, is the same though. Now, what about caching? I mentioned that is the difficult part. It is pretty aggressive and potentially complex in Next.js. It's definitely one of the harder parts of Next.js, and I do cover it, just like all the other important Next.js concepts in my Next.js course, in case you want to learn all about Next.js. That course is a great resource to get you from absolute beginner to advanced Next.js user. But caching is definitely one of the more problematic topics with Next.js. The advantage, of course, is that due to the aggressive defaults, you can potentially get pretty good caching for your users. But you can also shoot yourself into the foot pretty easily. For TanStack Start, I would summarize it as good defaults, way less aggressive than Next.js, and most importantly, consistent, in my experience at least, between development and production mode. It does also give you caching, so that when users navigate between routes, for example, data is cached for a certain time period, so that for rapid navigation, you're not sending a bunch of requests to your server. And that, of course, helps a lot with performance, but it's not caching everything or trying to cache everything on different layers, and that can make your life as a developer easier. It also, of course, means, though, that if you want to get the best performance for your users and potentially save traffic, you have to set good caching headers yourself and think a bit more about how you cache your application than you maybe need to do with Next.js. There you have to think about other problems, though. Now, what about stability? Now here I'll probably give both 2 pluses. They're both pretty stable. Obviously Next.js is more mature, but in my experience it has been quite buggy over the last couple of years. Especially the development server has had its problems with crashes and so on. But it got way better, and overall it's a stable experience, and there are of course hundreds and thousands of applications that use it that are running in production without issues. That is definitely important to note. Obviously we had those React security vulnerabilities, but for one, some of them could be discovered in the future and also affect TanStack Start, especially once they also start supporting React server components. And 2, that is not primarily a problem of Next.js, of course. TanStack Start is still in release candidate phase, and I have definitely encountered my fair share of problems with it. Some weird crashes, weird error messages, weird behaviors here and there, so I could also just give it 1 plus for that, but since it is in release candidate phase, and for that it is pretty stable, I'll go for 2 here. Just be aware that you can definitely run into some problems when using TanStack Start. That being said, though, I have applications running in production, like buildmygraphic.com here, which you can use to build amazing infographics with help of AI that are powered by TanStack Start and run without problems, and also were no problem to build. What about batteries included? So how easy is it to get optimized image rendering, internationalization, or any of that fun stuff? Here, Next.js is definitely doing a better job. It has its built-in image component, it has built-in internationalization support, and TanStack Start doesn't have any of that. Not sure if it's planned, not sure if it's important for you. It's definitely not something you need. There are other alternatives, third-party packages you can use. Maybe you don't even want the built-in stuff, but if that is something you care or worry about, yeah, then Next.js is probably the better choice here. And then what about deployment? That is a difficult topic. Next.js is built by Vercel, of course, and if you deploy it on Vercel, it's super easy and smooth. Everything is optimized for that. Historically, it has been a bit difficult to deploy it on your own servers, for example, but to be fair, the Next.js team really has done some work to make that easier, write better documentation, and therefore nowadays, I would say you can absolutely deploy it on other services without a lot of problems too. So that is 2 or 3 pluses. 3 pluses if you use Vercel, and 2 probably if you use other providers, I would say. For TanStack Start, I will go for 2 here right now, but I could also give it 3. The main reason for me giving 2 is that at the point of time where I'm recording this, the hosting documentation is still a bit tricky. There are officially supported partners like Cloudflare and Netlify, which have pretty good documentation and where deployment probably is pretty smooth. I haven't used those though. If you want to run it on your own VPS, for example with Bun, there are some instructions here, but I found it a bit hard to follow them or ran in some issues, which were all solvable, but it definitely took me some time. I think once there is a good guide for deploying TanStack Start with Bun or Node on a VPS, deployment will definitely get easier, especially if that guide includes recommendations regarding some best practices you should follow or potential pitfalls you may be facing. But as mentioned, you could definitely also go for 3 pluses here, depending on how you look at that. As I mentioned, this is all subjective and just my experience, my thoughts. And obviously, I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts. If you made the switch or what you think about Next.js and TanStack Start, if you're considering switching, or if you use neither of them and you instead use another option.